Welcome to the 33rd Vigil for Julian Assange Online. I'm Joe Lauria from Consortium News, and I'm joined by Elizabeth Voss, also of Consortium News. We have a lot of news to discuss this week, so we'll get right into the headlines. First, we'll start with some good news. Swedish court blocked a request from the prosecutors for a European arrest warrant in the reopened case, the sexual assault allegations from 9 years ago. Assange has never been charged. He was questioned in the embassy after a long time when he had requested, or he would welcome the Swedes to go over there and talk to him. They refused under British pressure. That case was dropped twice before and now has been reopened again. And the courts turned down this request. Apparently, when this last happened, in 2010, when Assange actually lost his extradition hearings to Sweden, which is why he went into the Ecuador embassy, the prosecutor had made the request for the arrest warrant, which was granted, not a court, and that's the way it's supposed to happen. So this time a court asked for the extradition and the arrest warrant, rather, which is necessary for the extradition, and it was denied. So he's not going to Sweden unless the prosecutors appeal, but they've indicated they will fly to London to question him in Belmarsh prison. So that was a bit of good news because, in my view, it puts the pressure on Great Britain to make the decision now alone. They can't palm him off to Sweden. And the other bit of good news was, well, the United States Department of Justice decided they would not add further charges to Assange in regard to the Vault 7 indictment. That was, of course, the Vault 7 release. The Vault 7 release was one of the biggest of WikiLeaks. It made public some of the most closely held secrets of the CIA, particularly their spying methods. It absolutely incensed the then CIA director, Mike Pompeo, who afterward called WikiLeaks a hostile non-state intelligence service. They are not going to add charges on that, but as we'll hear later in the headlines, there's a possibility of other charges coming on a completely different matter about which we know only very little at the moment. Elizabeth.
Right. Yeah, no, so it's good to start with a little bit of good news, but unfortunately, we also have headlines regarding the fact that after Assange's Espionage Act indictment, police in Australia also moved against more journalists for publishing classified material. Consortium News reported that following the arrest and Espionage Act indictment of Assange, a number of police actions against journalists for publishing classified information and other journalistic activity heightened fears among mainstream journalists that they could be next. So we saw that in Sydney, Australia, on Wednesday, police raided the offices of the taxpayer-funded Australian Broadcasting Corporation, copying thousands of files relating to a 2017 ABC broadcast that revealed allegations of war crimes by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. The 3 Australian federal police officers and 3 police technicians entered ABC's Sydney headquarters with a search warrant that named 2 ABC investigative journalists and the network's news director. The police demanded to look through the journalists' emails, ABC reported. David Anderson, the ABC managing director, said it was highly unusual for the national broadcaster to be raided in this way. And they said that this is a serious development and raises legitimate concerns over freedom of the press and proper public scrutiny of national security and defense matters. The ABC stands by its journalists, will protect its sources, and continue to report without fear or favor on national security and intelligence issues when there's a clear public interest. And that was from John Lyons, ABC's executive director and head of investigative journalism. He tweeted, live tweeting AFP raid. Don't think I've done one of these before. He also said that the federal police were going through dozens of emails with the authority to delete or even change their content. So protagonist Winston Smith's job in Orwell's 1984 was to rewrite news archives. So yeah, I mean, it's just an absolutely absurd story. And we also had a political editor's home that was raided in Canberra. So Canberra police on Tuesday morning, in an unrelated case, entered the home of political editor of the Murdoch-owned Daily Telegraph. And that was journalist Anika Smethurst, who opened her front door to find 7 AFP officers waiting for her because she dared to do her job and keep the nation informed on what its government was doing. And that was a quote from the Telegraph in an editorial. We also saw French journalists arrested, and San Francisco police raided a journalist's home as well in the US. So overall, this is a huge, huge escalation in the prosecution and persecution of journalists. And I think that finally, although far too late, we're seeing these journalists wake up to the danger of prosecution of Assange.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the Smethurst arrest was because of an article she'd written in April of 2018, last year. It was about the possibility of new laws in Australia to allow spying on civilians, ironically. That's what her story was about. The story that ABC was rated over was, as you mentioned, a story about Afghanistan in which they revealed crimes that were committed by soldiers, alleged war crimes. It was leaked by a lawyer, very senior lawyer in the Australian Army, who went through the channels to try to be the whistleblower, and they just attacked him instead. So he went to the ABC. He's been arrested. He's been giving a lot of interviews, and he said that he was disappointed actually in the ABC coverage because he had given evidence that senior officers were aware of these crimes and did nothing about it. In other words, he wanted generals to be exposed, but the ABC only wrote about the lowly soldiers. But nonetheless, that was a story from 2017, very similar to WikiLeaks about Afghanistan, a revelation of a war crime. And here are the police marching in. Now, the point I'm making here is April 2018 and 2017. These were stories from a year and 2 years ago. And why now, only about 2 weeks after the espionage indictment of Assange, do we see these two arrests in Australia? And WikiLeaks provides maybe an answer in a tweet. It said, and this is while the raid was still going on, the criminalization and crackdown on national security journalism is spreading like a virus. The Assange precedent is already having effect. Journalists must unite and remember that courage is also contagious. Elizabeth.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And we also saw some unfortunate news this week about Assange's father being bumped by doctors. I don't know if you were going to discuss that, Joe, but it's very concerning, and a lot of us were horrified hearing that.
Yeah, I'll take that one up. But before I do, I wanted to mention that there is now calls in the Australian Parliament for new laws, regulations, even constitutional changes to protect journalism. This could be a major issue. Australia does not have a First Amendment. They don't have a Bill of Rights. There's been calls for a Charter of Rights in the Parliament. So there's been enormous backlash to this. Assange's father, John Shipton, was in London a couple of days ago. He might still be there, and he had an appointment to see his son in the hospital ward of Belmarsh Prison, and his appointment had to be canceled because two doctors were going there instead at that time to see his son. And that was a report in the Brisbane Courier Mail newspaper. They quote Shipton as saying, "My visit was double booked. It has been canceled. The doctor's visit must be at short notice because a double booking occurred." This leads us into really with the main story that I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth, but he is still in the hospital, and yet we have seen a video emerge just a couple of hours ago, published by Abruptly on RT and on YouTube. Elizabeth.
Right. So we saw that video emerge just, within 24 hours of the press realizing that a Belmarsh prison inmate had allegedly provided photos of Julian Assange via Twitter. And we had a report on that broke the story by Cassandra Fairbanks that I'd like to read part of to you all, just to get us up to speed on this story. So the Gateway Pundit exclusively reported it with photos as well as the testimony of the alleged fellow inmate of imprisoned WikiLeaks founder Assange inside London's Belmarsh prison. So the inmate, who wished to remain anonymous, sent multiple photos of Assange from inside Belmarsh maximum security prison and spoke to the Gateway Pundit about the WikiLeaks founder situation using a contraband phone he has inside. So Assange is imprisoned in the United Kingdom and faces 18 charges at this time under the Espionage Act, or at the time of writing, I believe there's talk of another indictment on the way that we'll talk about later. But if extradited and convicted, Assange could face a maximum sentence of 175 years, et cetera, et cetera. The report, Cassandra spoke to the inmate at at hand here, and said that through a series of online messages and a phone call for multiple hours on Wednesday evening, the conversation said she asked him in the conversation if he was a prisoner or someone who works in the prison, and what his motivation was, whether it was to extort money from the organization, i.e. WikiLeaks. And the prisoner said, quote, "I'm in prison right now," sending a photo from inside his cell. He said, extort for what reason? He exposed the biggest scandal in the world. Whose side do you think someone in prison would be on? The government who has us locked up here, or a fellow prisoner who actually doesn't deserve to be here? The inmate said that he believes Assange needs his story told properly and is attempting to do what he can to help. He said that he hoped publishing the photos would lead to more people reading about his case. When asked if they were attempting to sell the photos, the inmate claimed that the Sun had offered him $10,000, but he declined because the publication was not interested in telling Assange's story properly. He said that he was only willing to share what he had to say and the accompanying photos with an outlet that supports his fellow inmate, and reiterated that his goal was simply to raise awareness about the truth of Assange's case. The photos feature Assange prior to his illness and being moved into the prison's hospital wing last month. The Gateway Pundit was not able to verify if Assange is aware of the existence of the photographs, and the Gateway Pundit was not asked for and did not provide any compensation for the interview or permission to use the photos. And I believe that, one of the reasons that this was important to get out there was, just as the inmate said, to, kind of beat the establishment media who may have used this for some sort of untoward, misguided story. But the inmate went on to say, quote, "He's not going to win this case through the law. He's going to win it because there's a public outcry." And he added that the mainstream media is controlled by the government, and said that the internet is the one thing they can't control. And all of the post was for Assange, about 500 letters for him, referring to the letters that are sent to the prison. Another quote from them said, "I am particularly alarmed at the recent announcement by the US Department of Justice of 17 new charges against Mr. Assange under the Espionage Act, carrying up to 175 years in prison. This may as well result in a life sentence without parole, or possibly even the death penalty." So that's just a selection of quotes from the prisoner published by the Gateway Pundit. Joe, what are your thoughts on that one?
Well, these still photos that we saw yesterday have now been backed up with the video. I was very suspicious when I saw the photos initially. And when reading Cassandra's story, there's many, many questions that arise, and we can talk about that. This does not sound like a prisoner to me, the way he's speaking. It just, the way he's talking about Assange and his real story, and he turned down $10,000. Why not pounds? The story actually says, in Cassandra's story, says that while we cannot confirm the authenticity of any of the inmates' statements or motives, so that's a big caveat there, whether this was really a prisoner talking to Cassandra or not, whether he's responsible for these photos. The timing of this is the most disturbing thing to me. It comes just a few days after the UN rapporteur put out his report in saying that Assange had been psychologically tortured, that he couldn't speak without jumping up and down. And we know now that he was hospitalized. He's still in the hospital. And these pictures make him look quite, well, I think he looks relatively healthy to compared to someone who's in a hospital bed. He's right. Smiling. He's smiling. He's not in solitary, at least in these, as we've heard from WikiLeaks, that he was spending 23 hours a day inside. We could talk again. You can't get a cell phone in there, so somebody clearly smuggled in a cell phone. If it was indeed a prisoner who took these pictures, I don't know who's behind this. I really don't. I have huge questions about that we're going to ask our guests about in a minute. Let's read the next headline, which is simply a short one. Well, in relation to that, WikiLeaks tweeted a day or two ago from an interview with the Meltzer, Mr. Niles Meltzer, the rapporteur on torture, and he was asked, if your calls are ignored, do you fear that Assange could actually die in prison? And he said, absolutely, yes, that's a fear. I think it is very real. So Meltzer saying in this interview, I think it was with ABC Radio in Australia, that he thinks he could die in prison. And then all of a sudden we see these pictures of a pretty healthy and smiling Julian Assange in a jail that looks almost like, these guys are hanging out and they have little table football game there. So I want to. That's all I'm going to say about that right now. The extradition hearing date that Assange was supposed to stand for was June 12th. It's been moved back to June 14th, and it will now take place in Belmarsh Magistrates Court. In other words, the courtroom in the prison. That means Assange is not healthy enough to come and travel to the Magistrates Court in London outside of the prison. Next story, Elizabeth, about the possibility of new charges that WikiLeaks put out this release, I believe, yesterday, and it's quite interesting, or today, I can't recall, but if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it was yesterday evening, U.S. time. WikiLeaks prepared a press release and published a press release stating on Twitter, quote, the DOJ planning to file an additional indictment against Assange. Trump's DOJ is so desperate to build its case against Assange, it is using a star witness who is a sociopath, a convicted con man, and sex criminal involved in an FBI entrapment operation against WikiLeaks. And I'm going to read at least part of the statement by WikiLeaks, their press release. They said that the United States Department of Justice is preparing a new superseding indictment against WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange before the extradition request deadline on June 14. Dutch public broadcaster NOS reported that Sigurdur Thordarson was flown to the United States last week, where he was comprehensively interrogated in preparation for the filing of the new superseding indictment against Julian Assange by the end of next week. NOS reported that on May 6th this year, FBI Special Agent Megan Brown, who leads the FBI investigation against Assange, traveled to Iceland together with prosecutor Kellen Dwyer from the Eastern District of Virginia to reinterrogate FBI informant Thordarson with the help of Icelandic police. Dwyer's cut and paste error led to the revelation in November 2018 that the Department of Justice had indicted Assange. On May 27th, U.S. authorities flew Sigurdur Thordarson, sorry about that name, to Washington, D.C. for further interrogations, where he remained until June 1st. Kristen Hafrenson, the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, said, quote, the Trump administration is so desperate to build its case against WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange that it is using a diagnosed sociopath, a convicted con man and sex criminal who was exposed by the highest levels of the Icelandic government as an FBI informant and who was involved in an entrapment operation in 2011 against Julian Assange. So Thordarson, who was recently released from prison, agreed to be interrogated to help build a case against Assange. Thordarson had served a 3-year sentence for multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud, including against WikiLeaks, and sex crimes against 9 minors. Thordarson stole tens of thousands of dollars from WikiLeaks and impersonated Assange in order to carry out the embezzlement. As part of the criminal prosecution of Thordarson in Iceland, he was examined by a forensic psychiatrist who diagnosed him as a sociopath. Thordarson told NOS that the interrogations focused on his communications with fellow FBI informant Hector Monsegur, aka Sabu. These contacts involve an operation by the FBI that was exposed as an entrapment operation against Assange by the Interior Minister of Iceland, Ögmundur Jónasson, as reported by the Daily Mail in 2013. And while the case would collapse in the US due to the prosecution's reliance on testimony by Thordarson and Monsegur, who are not credible witnesses, the United States can conceal their witnesses' identities during UK extradition proceedings in order to boost their chances of winning. And this will make it impossible for Assange to challenge the credibility of the witnesses during UK extradition proceedings, which will commence on the 14th of June. In 2011, the Icelandic government expelled 8 or 9 FBI agents and prosecutors who had flown from the Eastern District of Virginia because they were conducting unauthorized activities on Icelandic soil against Assange and WikiLeaks. This episode was reported in the New York Times in 2013. At the time, Iceland's Minister in the Interior, Ögmundur Jónasson, told the Daily Mail that he had made it clear at the time that if he had to take sides with either WikiLeaks or the FBI or CIA, he would have no difficulty choosing. He would be on the side of WikiLeaks. By contrast, the current Icelandic government has cooperated with the Trump administration's effort to build a case against WikiLeaks. Kristen Hafrenson said yesterday sent a letter demanding an explanation from the Icelandic Prime Minister, foreign minister, et cetera, et cetera. And last week, of course, as we just discussed, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Niels Melzer presented his findings, which obviously discussed the fact that he believed that Assange had been tortured by the ongoing psychological persecution against him. So, Joe, I don't know what
Yes,
you're
it's very troubling. Obviously, especially the part where they could use this evidence in the extradition hearing and not have to reveal who the witnesses are. But that means the U.S. will have to file these charges by June 14. Now, that's the deadline to get all the charges in that they want him extradited for. Of course, just about every FBI informant is some kind of criminal and a not credible witness, very much impeachable. However, they have some kind of physical evidence or forensic evidence, then the credibility of the witness is not as essential. It's if he could produce something. Now, he was known as a hacker, this guy, Siggy, I think his nickname was. We'd have to think that maybe this is what they're trying to build, because this is also, I think, a backlash. The backlash that they got from the Espionage Act from major media figures like Maddow. I think the government feels on safer ground from public relations point of view with a charge like the initial one of computer intrusion, which we know was not really hacked because Chelsea Mann had legal access to all that material. She just needed her identity hidden, and the indictment explains that, even though they try to get away with this computer intrusion thing. So we'll have to wait and see what these charges might be. But even if it's just used for the extradition purposes, that would be troubling enough, let alone whether they actually tried to charge him in a courtroom with that later on. Lastly, we have again some good positive feelings about this whole saga that we've been talking about for months now, and it's just a couple of tweets I wanted to read out from two people who support Julian Assange. The one is Glenn Greenwald. He tweeted, "Between exposing massive U.S. war crimes and then committing the even worse sin of publishing documents harmful to Hillary and the DNC, Julian Assange is so despised in the West that even slowly torturing him to death with no medical care, that's what's been happening, is viewed as justified." And the response to that from Jill Stein, the Green Party presidential candidate, was, "Time to call Julian Assange what he is, a political prisoner, persecuted for publishing information that reveal crimes of the powerful. Democrats, Republicans, and global elites despise him for exposing war crimes and corruption. Fight for his freedom to protect our own. Free Assange."